Welcome to Quick Tips from the C-Suite. I'm Travis Thomas. Can I tell you something that I've never shared publicly? There was a season in my career when I believed I was leading well from the outside. Everything looked successful. My business was growing. The opportunities were expanding, and people around me saw momentum. And if you had to ask me at that time what the biggest challenge was, I could have given you a long list. My team, my clients, the market, communication, timing, resources, relationships. I genuinely believed the obstacle to my success existed somewhere outside of me. I was convinced that if enough people changed, everything would finally work the way I believed it should. And then one conversation quietly dismantled the entire story. I walked into that meeting believing I was there to help solve someone else's problems. I walked out carrying a realization that I wasn't prepared for. I wasn't seeing the situation clearly, not because I lacked experience, not because I lacked intelligence, but because I had become blind to one variable I'd never honestly examined: myself. Looking back now, I don't believe that was the hardest conversation in my career. I believe it was the most important because it forced me to confront something I think every leader eventually faces: the possibility that the greatest constraint to our leadership isn't the people around us, it's the version of ourselves we've stopped questioning. Today, I want to share that story, not because I have all the answers, but because I suspect I'm not the only leader who's ever mistaken certainty for clarity. And perhaps if my experience helps you recognize something in your own leadership a little sooner than I did, then the conversation will continue creating value long after it changed me. Let's begin. If you had met me during that specific season in my life, it was about 8 years ago. Wow, I remember it all too well. You probably would have described me as driven, extremely focused, very committed, passionate about serving people, and you would have been right, at least partially. What you wouldn't have seen, because I certainly couldn't, was what quietly was happening beneath the surface. My identity had become attached to the outcome. And without realizing it, I had begun believing that my value as a leader was measured by my ability to solve problems, to create results, to fix what wasn't working. And somewhere along the way, without ever consciously choosing it, I began carrying the weight of everything around me. If something was struggling, I believed it was my responsibility. If a relationship became difficult, I immediately began looking for a solution. If the business faced challenges, I just worked harder, longer, faster. From the outside, it probably looked like commitment. Internally, it had quietly become control. Then came that conversation. I still remember sitting across from someone I respected deeply on that day. I had walked into that meeting convinced we were there to discuss someone else's behavior, someone else's decision, someone else's contribution. For nearly an hour, I explained what wasn't working, what needed to change, why I believed things had become difficult. And they listened patiently, never interrupting me, never defending anyone. Then they asked me the question I'll never forget. Travis, what if none of this changes? I answered almost immediately, well, it has to. They smiled, not because they disagreed, because they knew something I didn't. And after a long silence, they asked me one more question, a question that has stayed with me ever since. What if the person who needs to change first is sitting in your chair? I wish I could tell you that I immediately embraced the question. I didn't. My first reaction was defensiveness. I mentally argued with it. I explained to myself why it couldn't possibly be me. I listed all the reasons the real problem existed somewhere else. Looking back now, that may have been the moment I learned one of the most important lessons of my life. Our first response to truth is rarely acceptance, it's protection. Because the ego isn't designed to seek truth, it's designed to protect identity. And when identity feels threatened, even the wisest leaders become remarkably skilled at explaining while everyone else needs to change first. And boy, am I skilled. That conversation, it didn't change my business overnight. It changed something far more important. It changed the questions I began asking myself and self. Instead of asking, who needs to change? I slowly began asking, what part of me is creating the experience I'm having? That one question didn't just make me a better leader, it began making me a different human being. Yes, just a reminder, longer after you have left an organization, the only thing anyone will remember about you is the way you made them feel. Over the years, I've come to realize that the conversation I shared wasn't unique to me. It simply exposed something that's true for all of us. The longer we lead, the easier it becomes to confuse who we are with what we do. Without realizing it, our identity slowly attaches itself to our success. It attaches to our position, our influence, our expertise, our ability to solve problems. And once that happens, every challenge begins to feel personal. Feedback feels like criticism. Disagreement feels like rejection. A difficult conversation feels like a threat. We've all been there. And that's not because it actually is, but because our nervous system has quietly decided that protecting our identity is the same as protecting our lives. And I've noticed something fascinating after thousands of conversations with executives. The most intelligent leaders, they're not immune to this. In fact, they're often the most acceptable because intelligence gives us something incredibly powerful, the ability to create compelling stories. Stories about why we're right, stories about why someone else needs to change, stories that allow us to avoid the one place growth is actually asking us to look within ourselves. And one observation continues to stay with me. Our greatest leadership challenges are rarely created by what happens around us. They're created by the meaning we assign to what happens around us. Think about that for a moment. Two CEOs can walk into the exact same board meeting, hear the exact same feedback, experience the exact same challenge. One becomes defensive, the other becomes curious. The circumstances didn't create the response, the identity behind the response did. And I've also learned that the ego isn't our enemy. It's just simply trying to protect us. It wants certainty, it wants control, approval, it wants safety. The challenge is that extraordinary leadership asks us to become comfortable living without many of those things. And the higher we rise as leaders, the less certainty we're guaranteed. Trust me. It's the less control we actually have. And the more often we'll find ourselves standing in conversations where humility serves us much, much better than always feeling like we need to be right. Perhaps that's why I stopped asking leaders, how do you become a better leader? Instead, I find myself asking a different question. What part of your identity is your leadership trying to protect? Because until we understand that, we'll spend years solving external problems while quietly recreating the internal ones. And that's the pattern I've seen far too many remarkable leaders repeat, including myself. For a long time, I believed leadership was about becoming more effective, learning more, working harder, making better decisions, communicating more clearly. And while all of those things matter, I've come to believe they aren't where leadership actually begins. Leadership begins the moment we become willing to see ourselves honestly, not the version we've worked so hard to protect, the version quietly influencing every decision we make. And one of the greatest gifts that conversation gave me wasn't an answer, it was a mirror. And mirrors can be extremely uncomfortable because they don't tell us who we wish we were. They simply reveal who we've become. And I began noticing things I'd never seen before. How quickly I became defensive with my ideas when they were challenged. How often I confused urgency with importance. How much energy I spent trying to control outcomes that were never mine to control. How frequently I entered conversations believing I already knew the answer. And none of these realizations were easy, but every one of them made me a better leader because awareness always precedes transformation. And I've often wondered why some leaders continue growing for decades while others quietly plateau. And I no longer think it's because of intelligence or experience. I think it's because some leaders never lose their willingness to be surprised by themselves. They remain curious, not only about markets or strategy or technology, they're curious about their own reactions, their own assumptions, their own patterns. And they've learned that the most important meeting they'll attend this week is the one they have with themselves. Today, before almost every significant conversation, I like to pause for a moment, not to rehearse what I'm going to say, but to ask myself a different question. Which version of Travis is about to walk into this room? Is it the version that needs to be right? Or the version that wants to control the outcome? The version that's seeking approval? Or the version that's simply willing to serve? I've discovered that question changes almost everything because leadership isn't only revealed by what we say, it's revealed by the consciousness from which we say it. Perhaps that's why I no longer believe the greatest risk to an organization is a poor strategy. It's an unconscious leader. Not unconscious because they lack intelligence, unconscious because they've stopped examining the stories shaping their decision. And when that happens, leadership slowly becomes reaction instead of intention, certainty instead of curiosity, control instead of trust. And the irony is, the more influence we gain, the more important this inner work becomes, because leadership doesn't amplify who we pretend to be. Leadership amplifies who we really are. And eventually, everyone else sees it. The only question is whether we've chosen to see it first. People often ask me, Travis, so what changed? Did business suddenly become easier? The answer is no. Did the difficult people disappear? The answer is no. Did uncertainty somehow go away? Absolutely not. Not at all. It actually intensified. The marketplace was still demanding. Leadership was still complex. The pressure to perform never diminished. What changed was me. And when I changed, the way I led changed. When the way I led changed, the conversations changed. When the conversations changed, the relationships changed. And when the relationships changed, the organization began changing with them. Not because I discovered a better leadership model, because I'd become a different leader. And one of the greatest misconceptions in leadership is that transformation begins with changing other people. In my experience, it almost never does. Transformation begins when the leader changes the emotional environment everyone else is working inside. I become less interested in proving my point and more interested in understanding theirs. I stopped walking into meetings believing I needed to have all the best answers. Instead, I became deeply committed to asking better questions. And something remarkable happened. People began speaking more honestly, not because they suddenly became more courageous, but because I had become safer to tell the truth too. And that realization humbled me. For years, I believed culture was something leaders created through vision. Today, I believe culture is created through emotional permission. People don't simply hear what leaders say, they study how leaders respond, especially when they're challenged, especially when they don't agree, especially when things don't go according to plan. Because in those moments, leaders give everyone else permission to react the same way. I've watched this pattern repeat itself across hundreds of executive teams. The emotional maturity of the leader quietly becomes the emotional ceiling of the organization. Think about that for a moment. If the leader becomes defensive, the organization learns to become cautious. If the leader needs certainty, innovation quietly slows. If the leader cannot admit mistakes, learning becomes dangerous. But when a leader becomes curious, the organizations become curious. When a leader becomes calm under pressure, clarity begins replacing fear. When a leader creates safety, truth begins arriving faster. And the organizations that receive truth early, they always make better decisions. Looking back, I no longer believe the greatest gift a leader gives an organization is vision or strategy or even execution. It's much more simple. It's permission. Permission for people to think differently, to challenge respectfully, to admit mistakes, to grow, and to become more fully themselves, because that's the kind of culture extraordinary organizations are built upon. Not one where leaders have all the answers, but one where people no longer fear bringing forward their truth. And perhaps that's why I now believe leadership isn't about changing organizations. Leadership is about changing the environment in which organizations become capable of changing themselves. And every meaningful transformation I've ever witnessed began that exact same way. That one leader became willing to change first. Thank you for joining me today. And until our next conversation, may you have the courage to tell yourself the truth, the wisdom to remain curious, and the humility to keep becoming. Always lead from the heart, live from your soul, and remember the greatest leader you will ever become has been within you this entire time. I'll see you next week.